the newsagents.
The sound of the streets this weekend in London as some demonstrators on a Palestinian rights protest are shouting jihad, jihad. Is that free speech in a country which cherishes that idea? Or is it a crime that's being committed, that has gone too far, that is a race hate crime, that is inciting terrorism? Where do you draw the line?
We already know where the Home Secretary is drawing that line, because Suella Braverman is meeting with the head of the Metropolitan Police in London to ask him to explain why those protesters were not arrested. She hears the word jihad as an incitement to terror and intimidation. Is she right, or has she overstepped the line? Welcome to the newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily.
And it has been a troubling weekend again, given events in Israel and Gaza and the uncertainty of that. But on this episode, we want to look at how that is manifesting itself on these shores, the ripples from the Mediterranean Sea that are reaching Britain. On Saturday, there was a huge protest by Palestinian supporters calling for a free Palestine, support for Gaza. On Sunday, there was a vigil at Trafalgar Square where people were saying, how can it be human to keep these hostages in Gaza that were taken by Hamas on the 7th of October? And then there are the questions over where does the law stand on this, on terrorism and on hate crimes?
And really, at face value, there should be no difference between those aims of the protest, that you can 100% support the release of hostages in Gaza who are the victims of Hamas, and you can 100% support the victims in Gaza who are also the victims of Hamas and the kind of atrocities that have been launched in the name of their freedom, which they probably almost certainly do not wholesale support. But I guess what we're talking about today is that tiny minority, that intersection of people who were part of the marches, who do maybe believe in the rights of Palestinian people, but who are vocally very keen to take that argument further into the realms of what is potentially anti-Semitic, what is potentially anti-Zionist, what is potentially threatening to many citizens who live and breathe and walk on the streets of London and the wider UK. And I guess this comes back to the use of certain words like jihad. There's no getting around it. We're going to talk about the word jihad. And we know that there are different meanings. We understand that there is a jihad meaning which is about the purity of your soul and the struggle of the inner being. And there's a jihad which means you can sort of fight for freedoms and you can fight wars in the name of Islam. But when it is being chanted on the streets in the context of those Saturday marches, certainly the Home Secretary heard something threatening and intimidating. And I'm guessing she wasn't alone.
Oh, I think that a lot of people will have heard things that were intimidating and destabilising and upsetting. And I think that, you know, if you are a member of the Jewish community, you just look at the statistics, at the number of hate crimes that are anti-Semitic incidents that have been reported since October the 7th, when Hamas went on that murderous regime in southern Israel, and Israel's response of aerial bombing of targets in Gaza, which has led to large numbers of innocent, women, children, men. There are very high emotions running on both sides. And I'm going back to your initial point, Emily, that it is perfectly possible to be a supporter of Palestinian rights and to say that the hostages should be freed, but it's polarising this country, and that there are more and more people who are saying, I don't give a damn about what Hamas did, I just care about what Israel's doing, and vice versa.
Yeah. I mean, I think the point is there should not be a conflict between those two positions. It is perfectly legitimate to loathe the Hamas terrorism events in Israel on October the 7th and perfectly legitimate to loathe what has happened in Gaza since then as a result of Hamas's actions and Israeli bombing to try and destroy the terrorist groups. In each case, the civilians have been the victims, and we get that. But the idea that you would be on both marches, I think, is probably far-fetched, is almost inconceivable, right?
I wondered what would have happened if you would have turned up at the march, both carrying a Palestinian flag and an Israeli flag.
Yeah.
Is it impossible to have support for both? If you believe in the two-state solution,
Yeah, you carry both flags.
you carry both flags.
Yeah.
And yet it seems inconceivable. I mean, it'll be fascinating to see if anyone would have dared.
That's your next newsagent's challenge.
Yeah, to go on to one of those demos with both flags.
I think anyone who's been in a protest, and when we've been covering protests, you know how true this is. You can start walking under one banner, which is, we believe in a two-state solution, and you take one step to the right and you're suddenly under the Hizb ut-Tahrir banner, and you're not quite sure how that happened, but the chanting behind you changes and it's a very different vibe, and any protest tends to pull in a lot of different groups, and you probably won't agree with most of what they're saying.
Well, look, I bet you on the pro-Palestine march on Saturday, there'd have been every sort of variety of kind of left-wing group, fringe groups of all sorts of descriptions.
Workers, the anti-apartheid,
exactly.
Marxist,
They've all been there, all trying to sell their magazines or their newspapers or whatever it happens to be. That is the nature of demonstrations. But, the police have got a responsibility for maintaining public order. There was an incident on Saturday where the tube train driver, decides he's going to get involved and has got things to say about Palestinian rights to a tube full of passengers who know nothing that he's about to do this.
Free Palestine! Free Palestine! Free Palestine!
Now, it seems to me that there is good reason why the train driver should be fired. I mean, I don't want to hear train drivers' political views, whether it's pro-Israel, anti-Israel, pro-Palestine, anti-Palestine. It's not the tube driver's job. Please get us to the next station safely and open the doors. Close the doors, move on. But is it against the law? Because it now sounds as though the Metropolitan Police is investigating whether he broke the law.
We've had this discussion in the office, actually, and occasionally, people in these roles, in positions, even the police, do get involved in protests. I mean, you've seen policing of pride marches, which has been very pro-pride. You've seen police take the knee. So I think there are these occasions where you do see people crossing the line and say, yeah, I might be a tube driver, I might be a police officer, but I believe in the rights of gay people, or I believe in the rights of the black community to, live without fear from the police. I guess
that this is something we can all agree on, telling people what to think when they're on a tube journey. Wrong side of the line. I think it was stupid and crass, and just stay out of it. You don't need to take a stand. We don't need tube drivers telling us what to think. Frankly, I'm kind of in a bit of a row with the Football Association. I don't think we need the Football Association telling us what to think.
Well, they don't know what to think. I mean, let's be really honest. They don't know what to think.
Because
but
politics
they think
is complex, and therefore, don't enter it. Don't get involved. Don't offer your view on it. But is it illegal? I mean, that's the problem I'm having with it, because I just don't see what the criminal offence is that this guy has committed, apart from being a bit of a prat.
So I think park your tube driver on one side, because
put him into the sidings.
Can you park a tube?
We'll take him into a sidings.
Yeah, that's the tube driver who will probably be disciplined or spoken to or whatever by his employer, but as you're saying, hasn't actually committed a crime. The area which is, I think, more grey is where the Home Secretary has waded in, and where even the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer, has pointed to gaps in the law. And I guess the question that we're trying to tackle today, and we always go sort of around this one, is do you have a right not to be offended, right? If I hear people shouting jihad on the streets, is it enough to say, I am offended, therefore the word should be banned, right? If I hear that word and I think of it as inciting violence or terror, does that then mean that people should be stopped from saying it. And of course, context is everything here. We know that jihad can refer to an inner struggle. We know it can refer to a war you're fighting with yourself. But if it is being chanted by a fundamentalist group in the context of a protest, it probably isn't talking about your inner spiritual struggle. Therefore, could that word then be banned, or should the group itself be banned? I guess, to wind it out, if I heard Allahu Akbar, again, it means God is great, right? In a mosque, that would have a totally different meaning to perhaps a darker meaning if you heard it when you were surrounded by people that were protesting or, felt threatening towards you. It becomes a very, very difficult contextualised argument to have about certain phrases or certain places, doesn't it? And you can understand that from a police perspective, they don't want to go round sort of asking everyone who's used that word what they meant by it, what was the context, what was the flag you were waving at the time, did you have a balaclava on, what was your innermost sort of hope and realisation from that word. It's incredibly complicated, and as you say, we really value freedom of expression.
Yeah. Look, there's enough division. There is enough heat in this subject at the moment. There is enough sense of kind of anger and fury and emotion that I think it ill behoves. I think there is so much emotion in this that it ill behoves people on the right or the extreme left to try to weaponise it still further. And I saw a commentator from America, from Washington, who I know, Niall Gardner. He works for the Heritage Foundation, the Margaret Thatcher Foundation for Freedom, I think his bit of it is, where he's a Thatcherite on the right. And he tweeted on yesterday, "For centuries, Great Britain was the most powerful nation in the world, feared by its enemies and standing tall as the guardian of Western civilization. Today, the streets of London are occupied by Islamist militants who hate the West, hate Britain and everything it stands for. Britain's leaders need to stand up for their country and act decisively against those who seek to destroy it from within." Now, you don't need to stir this up. It's stirred enough already without contributing to a misleading impression that you can't move around in London because there are jihadists everywhere. And I had a message from a mate in DC last night saying, "Guys, everything all right in London? It sounds terrible there." And that is the impression you can create. And I think that to exacerbate already heightened emotions is not cool.
But I think you use the word weaponise. And I think you're being naive if you're ignoring that is actually what some people with genuine good intention want to do. There are people who care passionately about the Palestinian cause, who see this as a moment to weaponise it. And I guess there are also people who feel passionately that the threat of anti-Semitism in this country is not taken seriously enough. And if you're not going to shout about it at a time like this, weaponise, if you like, then when are you going to? When are you going to alert people to the fact that it is a growing danger with an absolutely horrendously steep rise in cases in the last, 2 weeks? So I suppose the weaponisation is part of it. I mean, that has to be part of it. When you march, you're not just trying to get to the park, right? You are trying to change things.
So following his meeting with the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, Sir Mark Rowley, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, has just come out and fascinating comments on the way he sees the threat and the problem of policing at the moment.
The growth in hate crime against Muslim communities in London is up threefold, but against Jewish communities it's 13-fold compared to this time last year for this period. That's a horrific number. And it's not surprising that communities in that context are fearful and anxious, and that's what we were talking about today. On top of course, the protests which sort of give vent to a whole range of different opinions. I was explaining how we are absolutely ruthless in tackling anybody who puts their foot over the legal line. We're accountable for law. We can't enforce taste or decency, but we can enforce the law.
And he's also said that some of the lines, and I think by lines we probably should interpret that as laws, aren't in the right place. When it comes to the law on extremism and terrorism, extremist groups can still propagate toxic messages. And his suggestion has been the banning of Hizb ut-Tahrir. Now, this was the group that were making the jihad chants on Saturday. And for context, they are a banned group in many countries. They are a so-called Party of Liberation, literally, but it is an international pan-Islamist Islamic fundamentalist organisation whose stated aim is the re-establishment of the Islamic Caliphate to unite the Muslim community and to implement Sharia globally. So Mark Rowley's suggestion, one that he's now leaving for Suella Braverman, is maybe this should join the list of proscribed groups here in the UK. I mean, it does actually sound like the meeting had tangible or almost tangible outcomes, which is kind of rare because I think the police right now are under enormous pressure not to just knee-jerk do what politicians are telling them to do and not to do anything that would inflame community relations as a knock-on effect from everything that's happening in the Middle East right now.
In a moment, we'll be speaking to Sir Peter Fahy. He was the Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police, but perhaps more importantly in this context, was the former head of the government's Prevent strategy.
Well, joining us now is Sir Peter Fahy. You'll know him as the former Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police until 2015, also head of the government's Prevent strategy. And I think it's fair to say, Sir Peter, you've had your fair share of fairly hairy moments trying to police exactly this sort of protest that we've been talking about. The Home Secretary wants to know why people weren't arrested at the weekend's demonstration. Could you answer her that question?
Yes, I could, but the police have to make individual decisions, and I'm sure the Home Secretary knows that she can't direct operational decisions and operational matters as to how an individual demonstration is policed. But essentially what we've got here is the police trying to make sense of counter-terrorism law, hate speech law, public order law, the law around harassment and causing alarm and distress, and at the same time aware of the huge strength of emotions, having to make operational decisions in the heat of the moment. So if you're going to go and try and arrest somebody, will making that arrest just cause further disturbance? Could children and vulnerable people in the crowd be injured? How will that look on social media, whether you like it or not? That has to be a consideration in the world we live in. So it's a hugely complex situation. And at the same time, the police have to take into account their long-term relationship, with communities and trying to maintain confidence and not seem to be taking sides. And certainly, around this issue about the complexity of the law, there's nothing in English law that says using a particular word of itself, commits an offence. It is about the context. It is about the intention of the person using the word and the way that will be received. And obviously the police have got to try and make sense of that. And I think on Saturday they had experts, they had lawyers, and they had, counter-terrorism police in their control room trying to make sense of this. And so it's a really difficult situation they're trying to deal with.
Sure. Just explain this to me. When you said it's not the job of the Home Secretary to interfere in operational policing, what are the lines? Because I'm sure an awful lot of people listening to this would think, well, surely the Home Secretary's got a right to tell the Chief Constable of this constabulary or that what needs to happen.
The Home Secretary absolutely has a right, to set broad policy and certainly to hold the police to account and ask questions, although that's, again, confused in London because you've also got the Mayor of London as well. And what the Home Secretary shouldn't be doing is trying to direct individual decisions on whether people should be arrested or how particular words should be interpreted, or flags or other phrases in the context of a demonstration. That's not the way that we operate in our country. No, we don't have politically driven police. And at the end of the day, each officer is responsible for the individual decision they make to arrest somebody before the court. And as I say, have to take into account that overall context.
Do you think that this is Suella Braverman saying, I want to be driving this, I want to be Gold Commander? Or is it Suella Braverman just playing politics and playing to the gallery that I'd have been tougher on these people on the streets?
I'm certainly not naive, and the police are not naive. That, again, in this media-hungry, country and atmosphere, that the Home Secretary has to be seen to doing things. But you're absolutely right. We've seen a series of, interventions from her, which, have been in danger of crossing that line. And this sort of builds on the situation with the policing of the Sarah Everard vigil in London, where the Home Secretary of that time was making comments before she had, been given a full briefing on what had actually happened. And I think that is what, is making the whole situation far more complex. The police live in the real world. And I had a similar situation like this to deal with at the last Gaza, situation. And that was extremely difficult, dealing with that in Greater Manchester. But that it's now become far more complicated. Because of the whole influence of social media, everything being filmed. And in that context, individual Home Secretaries and politicians saying they have to give their view on particular interpretations of the law. But when it gets to the court, with due respect, what the Home Secretary says, as learned as she is, will not really play in. It will be about the officers justifying their decision, the position of the defence. And there is a danger that if that defence then tries to argue that the police were only doing what they were doing because of political direction, that could make the prosecution more complex.
If you were in that position and you heard the chant jihad, would you hear that in the context of the march on Saturday as an incitement of hatred or violence?
Well, I think to be fair to the Metropolitan Police, before the protest, they tried to give clear direction, not only to their officers, but also to the public and the community about how they'd interpret that. And they're absolutely be doing that, for instance, around a mosque or a Jewish school. And it, in that context, it appears to be very much incitement to violence, incitement to hatred. Then absolutely, the law should be enforced.
But not on a march.
Well, I think in a march it's far more complex as to what does that word mean. And there's been a lot of debate amongst academics and scholars and, religious leaders, even this morning, about what that word can mean to different people. And that's the difficulty, because the officer has to look at the context in that case. And then, if they make an arrest, we'll have to see what the person who made that chant themselves was actually intending.
So if it sounds threatening, I guess that's what I'm getting at. If it sounds threatening to a proportion of the community, would that direct your thinking at all? I mean, jihad will sound threatening to many members of the Jewish community, of people going into central London, if they hear it chanted on the streets.
Yes, absolutely.
Is that enough then for you to make arrests?
Of itself, it would not be enough. It is about the wider context that the police have to make sense of, including whether at that moment, it's the operationally right thing to do to go in and start making arrests. You can't just pick out one word and say, definitely, that is always going to be a breach of the law. Well, the police have to try and make sense of it in the context.
The other incident that has caused a big furore that took place on Saturday was a tube driver kind of going on the tannoy in a train saying support Free Palestine. I can see why TfL might want to fire him for getting involved in politics of any description. But what would be the criminal offence there? Because apparently the Metropolitan Police are investigating that.
Very hard for me to see an offence, in that, because that appears to be the state of Palestine. And that's part of the difficulty. If an allegation is made, the police have to investigate it, particularly when it's got very high profile. As in this situation, it doesn't actually mean that they feel that there's a prima facie case that anything should be done.
I suppose the argument would be, but if it intimidates people that are on the train and, suddenly a Jewish person feels threatened because they've heard this chant going through a train and that's been instigated by a driver, that doesn't cross a line. That's unpleasant, but it's not illegal.
I think you've described it absolutely right. It's unpleasant and absolutely not something that any public servant or people serving the public in that context, it's not part of their job to actually do that. And I think it's absolutely a case that should be dealt with by TfL under its own disciplinary procedures. It just shows the really complex, difficult atmosphere that there is around the country at the moment. I don't think I've ever seen it as bad as this.
Can I just get your direct response to Robert Jenrick, the Immigration Minister? He was pretty publicly critical of the police on Sunday for failing to arrest the protesters. And he said they should have been met with the full force of the law and was surprised by the police's decision. What message would you have for him?
Well, that he's perfectly entitled to have that view, but I would ask him to take into account the impact that has on the police trying to do a very difficult job where they feel that they're not being properly, supported by politicians who don't understand the complexities of what they're doing and don't sometimes understand, the difficulties of interpreting the law, but also their duty to try and maintain long-term community relations and confidence that the police are being fair and impartial. But I think it will just make the police feel they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't, and in a way make the job of police commanders even more difficult, in this situation. The police will never get it right. This is not a situation where you can get it right. You'll always be caught in the middle. And really what they need is politicians who understand that and try and explain that and give as much support as they can.
Would the police like to see any clarification of the law? Is the law clear enough as it stands? Or is it just that the police, whatever the law is of the land is, has to interpret it as it sees fit in any given circumstance?
I think it's the latter, really, John. There's always things that can be clarified. There are always new powers that can be added. But at the end of the day, lawyers make their money by then trying to interpret those particular words and those particular phrases and those particular powers. If you keep on using legislation to try and chase a particular set of tactics or a particular situation or an international situation at a particular time, history shows that doesn't really work, because all that happens, as I say, the situation changes, the protesters change their tactics. The policing of protest in the heat of the moment, can be extremely difficult. And on the whole, police officers are pretty suspicious when politicians say, we're really going to clarify the law, because when it gets to court in the cold light of day, it often fails at that point. So, whether we like it or not, protest and what people are concerned about and demonstrating about is constantly moving.
Sir Peter, thank you so much. Sir Peter Fahy, really good to have you on the News Agents.
Thank you very much. Before we go, it's the weekend after the by-elections, before and the political reverberations that are still being felt around Westminster. It's almost a year since Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister, which means you can now put in letters of no confidence if you feel that that is the way to go, given Tory losses. There was
another. You were going to say there'd be a special News Agents look at a year of Rishi Sunak tomorrow with Ben Riley-Smith, which there also will be, funnily enough.
But there's also a story this weekend which sort of has been denied, but had a certain resonance, which was that after the autumn statement in November, Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, is going to announce that he's going to stand down from Parliament because he doesn't want to have a Michael Portillo moment at the next general election, i.e. what happened to Portillo in 97 when he lost Enfield Southgate, and that picture of a grinning Stephen Twigg everywhere, which became the iconic symbol of that election.
So much so that there was a book written called Were You Still Up for Portillo? Were you still up for Portillo?
Yeah, well, I was working all night, yes.
I was watching in Hong Kong, so I had a particularly nice time.
I was at Conservative Central Office all night, so you can imagine what a party that was.
But I guess that's right. So the point is that Michael Portillo became the biggest scalp of the night of the 1997 election, and Jeremy Hunt reportedly was nervous because of his own constituency position at the moment. He's going to face boundary changes from southwest Surrey to a new constituency that will be called Godalming and Ash, and he is sitting on a majority of around 8,800, which on a good day would be fine. But when you get pollsters like Frank Luntz warning Conservatives that anything over around 7,000, 8,000 may now be at risk, you can see why these sort of rumours would start to spread. Now, we should just say that Jeremy Hunt has knocked this firmly down, and he said Parliament will have to put up with me for much longer. I mean, what else can you say? If you're about to deliver an autumn statement, if you're the Chancellor, if a lot hangs on what you're going to do in the next year, you can't just go, yeah, and by the way, that'll be the end of me. So whatever he's thinking of doing, there is no chance that he will tell us. I don't think he's stepping down for many, many months. But I do think what we've heard today is a slight... Can you have a slight nail in the coffin? It was a quote from the Prime Minister who was asked this, who said...
Well, it was the Prime Minister's spokesman who said the Prime Minister and Chancellor are working extremely closely together on the autumn statement. Obviously, we wouldn't speculate on constant reshuffle speculation. So they're not going to speculate on speculation. But I think
just by answering that question, by saying what you're working very hard on, you basically put flashlights all over it. We are working very hard on the autumn statement. In other words, something that's going to happen in about 3 weeks' time, right? It doesn't reek of longevity, that.
I think it sounds like the chairman of the football club who says, we've got full confidence in the manager after you've lost the last 8 games and you're at the bottom of the table. In political terms, the Tories are at the bottom of the table. It would be one hell of a move to get rid of Jeremy Hunt, who was the figure, the symbol of stability after the whole Liz Truss period. And I think it would be very, very bold, shall we say.
Well, I think you can see
him.
it 2 ways. You can either say it would be kind of bold stroke ludicrous to do that, or you can say, what better signal than the ship is now steadied a year on after Liz Truss than to say Jeremy Hunt has done his very appreciated job of steadying the ship. Now I want, for example, a Claire Coutinho figure to start coming up with, I don't know, different, newer, brighter, creative ways of not quite cutting tax. There is an argument to be made that that is going on as well.
I tell you what, if you want to frame the choices that the Conservative Party now have following those by-elections and the kind of shock that it has sent through the party, Rishi Sunak can't just reshuffle the whole cabinet. But what a choice it would be if you say, I keep Suella Braverman exactly where she is as Home Secretary, but I move out Jeremy Hunt, or I keep Jeremy Hunt and move out Suella Braverman. Because then you will be seeing very clearly the direction of travel that Rishi Sunak thinks he has to go to have any chance of winning the next election. And I think that there are pressures on him to go to the right, keep Suella, get rid of Hunt, get more tax cuts, or, you know, if you're the Labour Party, you're thinking, go to the right, go as far as you want. We'll take the centre ground, thank you very much.
I just think there are hammers on his head at the moment from all sides. I mean, it's entirely possible he gets rid of both, you know, and sort of tries to find it, or none of them. And tomorrow we're going to be looking into this in a bit more detail. What we saw after their surprise win in Uxbridge was what we've now dubbed the ULEZ strategy. In other words, oh my God, ULEZ just won a constituency for us. It won a by-election for us. Therefore, we must scrap all green taxes forevermore. What will be the Mid-Beds Tamworth strategy now? What will be the new ULEZ? Will it be gay conversion therapy bans? What will it be? Small boats? Will it be? Anyway, we're going to get into that tomorrow in some depth and try and work out whether the Suella strategy broadly to the right is going to dominate, or whether he's got the sort of centrist, the One Nation Tories in his ear and he's listening there.
We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.